Hey guys, you are joining me today in my brand new office and altar space, which as you can hear from the kind of echoey sound and as you can see from like the blank walls behind me, it's not really currently an office space or altar space, but in the next week I'm going to be starting to move things in here. I'm going to be starting to really make it my own. So I'm incredibly excited to have this space. It's really beautiful. Once it's all set up, I will probably do a proper kind of tour for you. I've also been recording small bits of footage of the work that I've been doing on the living room upstairs. I'm gradually working on various rooms in the house to do kind of temporary renovations to them, and I'm going to share that with you as well. So I might do one video that's kind of all about the house and the progress I've made and all of that kind of thing. But without further ado, I'm going to make do with what I have today in this kind of echoey room and hope that the audio isn't too bad for you. And I want to talk about a topic that kind of popped up today for me as I was doing some reading for my PhD. So I'm working on 2 chapters at the moment for my PhD that are very kind of focused on other people's work on the area. I'm doing a lit review and an introductory chapter. So I've been skimming through some of the books that I've previously read on the New Age, on paganism, on alternative spirituality and all that kind of jazz. And I stumbled on a concept in one of the books I was reading by Wouter Hanegraaff. I can't remember the exact name of the book. I think it's New Age Spiritualities in the Western World, or something along those lines. He has a lot of different books on the New Age and particularly on Western esotericism. But it was one of his earlier kind of books specifically on the New Age that was published sometime around the late 90s or early 2000s. And I don't actually remember, I didn't actually carefully read this section where he was talking about this concept. Ordinarily, like I feel it almost uncomfortable making this video because ordinarily if I have my academic hat on, I can't go kind of commenting on something that somebody has said without knowing exactly what it is that they've said. But for the purposes of this video, it's enough for me to have just been inspired by just the terms that he was using and to bounce off that and talk to you about it from kind of a personal perspective. And that's what I'm going to do today. So the 3 terms that he mentioned were faith, reason and gnosis. And he said essentially he seemed to be kind of making the point that while kind of Christianity traditionally in the West has been, and especially Protestant Christianity, has been associated with faith, and then kind of scientific thought has been associated with reason, that the New Age is associated with Gnosis, which is something kind of separate and quite different to both of those modes of thought or modes of belief or experience, I suppose you could say. So at this point I've stumbled on so many different types of characterizations of the New Age and alternative spirituality and what have you, and it's rare that any of them kind of jump out at me still at this point and kind of make me think in a new way. But this was one of those moments where it actually did kind of make me stop and think, he's got a really good point here, and I actually really want to bring in some of his ideas here more into my thesis. But more importantly for me, for the sake of this video anyway, is that it actually rang true to me from a personal level, and I kind of wanted to explore that idea about the kind of relationship between reason, faith and gnosis, and how I think all 3 are definitely, I mean I don't think he was saying this at all, but I definitely don't think that those 3 different areas can be separated from one another when it comes to religion or spirituality, and they tend to kind of all be intertwined in certainly a lot of spiritual traditions. You're going to see those 3 things intertwined. But I did think it was interesting that his main point seems to be in this book that the New Age is kind of a reaction against faith and reason. It's a reaction against the Christian paradigm and also the science, the kind of rationalistic science paradigm in the West, and it's kind of a reaction to both of those and an attempt to suggest that the New Age is a better mode of thinking and mode of being that can kind of surpass both of those kind of problematic paradigms and bring the 2 together in some way. So Gnosis is generally defined as the knowledge of spiritual mysteries or esoteric knowledge of spiritual truth and those kinds of ideas. So it's associated with truth and knowledge, but not from a perspective of either faith or reason. So the knowledge associated with faith, this is something that I find difficult to grapple with because I was not raised Christian in any very strict way. But the faith associated with the knowledge of Christ, for example, in the Christian religion, is very much kind of hinging on the authority of the church, the authority of the Bible. And you could definitely argue that there is a certain level of gnosis implied in that an individual has to kind of experience Christ or invite Christ into themselves, I believe. They have to kind of make themselves available to the Holy Spirit, to Christ, in order to kind of become one with the truth of God. In my understanding, now that might be kind of an understanding of it from a very kind of heavily pantheistic perspective of mine, but there is definitely a sense of that experience has to come into play in some way. But faith is something that you are expected to uphold in spite of and in the face of any doubts, and completely separate from reason or even from experience, I would argue. I'm not totally sure where Christians feel like they get their faith from, because I'm not a Christian and that faith never stuck for me. So it's hard for me to kind of grasp it or wrap my head around it. But to me, it seems to be largely based around the authority of the church, of the Bible, and to some lesser extent on kind of personal experience and personal reasons, personal feelings for upholding that faith. Reason, on the other hand, is associated with science and with philosophical thought, with logical thought, and so having a belief based in reason is something that you kind of figure out through using deductive thought, through using, empirical means of, gathering evidence and looking at, the kind of physical facts of something or what have you. And that's, again, quite a different way of understanding things. And that would have literally nothing to do with having faith, right? Because they're almost the antithesis of each other. Like, you can't really, the whole point of having faith is that you don't need to use reason in order to have a belief that requires faith. And often those two will come kind of up against each other, will be at loggerheads. Gnosis, in my understanding, it's very much attached to mysticism, and mysticism is very attached to personal experience and experiences of the divine, direct experiences of the divine. So the idea with Gnosis, especially in New Age and pagan circles, it's been very much attached to direct information gleaned from the divine. And I do believe that this is the way that it is kind of generally historically used as well. That gnosis is knowledge that is gleaned from direct spiritual experience, from direct connection to the divine, and so on. And so there's kind of less of a need for faith, because if somebody is kind of basing their beliefs on gnosis, they are basing their beliefs on probably an ongoing experiential relationship with divinity. Even if it's not ongoing on a kind of daily basis, they probably have ways of accessing that kind of experience and that kind of mindset, that kind of perception. And even if it's just based on the memory of that experience, it generally is very kind of experiential. And again, reason just doesn't really come into it necessarily at all. It's all about feelings, experiences, mental states, conscious states, and so on. Large swathes of alternative spirituality and the New Age and paganism and all that kind of spiritual milieu in general are very much gnosis based when it comes to how we align our beliefs and where we decide to place our most kind of trust and the most respect, I would say, in terms of what we take into account and under consideration when we are building up a spiritual practice, a spiritual worldview, and when we're paying attention to the authority of other people and what other people have to say as well. I would argue that a lot of us will place a lot more merit and value in someone's description of their personal mystical experience of the divine versus something that they have kind of logically worked out, or versus just a sort of a broad kind of faith-based statement. And I do think that the preference for this kind of mode of knowledge or mode of belief really lies in the ability of gnosis to kind of bring together faith and reason, in its ability to kind of transcend that binary, because for you to kind of base a belief system or a practice on gnosis, you don't have to exclude reason from it, because it's experiential. I feel like that way of knowing, that way of imbibing information and coming to conclusions, it involves, to my mind, our entire sensory experience. It involves all the information that we have to hand about a particular idea or about the divine and so on. And to my mind, there is potentially more room in there for including very kind of rationally based notions about the universe, about how things work, about anything like that. And you're not looking, unlike with, a faith-based religion, you're not necessarily looking to specific traditions of belief, to specific authorities, to textual authorities, either to kind of back up that experience or so and so on. But at the same time, Gnosis and reason are definitely not the same thing, in that you can kind of choose to base your spirituality on an experience, on an experiential kind of knowledge, and it both doesn't have to be based on a kind of faith-based religious tradition, but also it doesn't have to just be based in reason. It is perfectly possible to, in my own personal experience, build an entire spirituality, an entire spiritual practice, an entire spiritual belief system around those kind of experiential moments, those kind of moments of deep interpersonal experiences, and not be able to necessarily match that up with what you know from the perspective of science or reason, and to be able to kind of hold this as a different kind of knowledge, as a different kind of belief system, or a different way of understanding the world. And that is very much how I operate in the world. I have, generally speaking, in my day-to-day life, I have a very science-oriented, rational worldview. But then when it comes to my spirituality, when it comes to sitting at the altar, when it comes to just having those moments of feeling spiritual connection, it's not that I throw all of those science-based beliefs out the window, but I can hold space for other beliefs too. I can hold space for thoughts and ideas and imaginative concepts that really have nothing to do with those kind of science-based paradigms. And now that I'm thinking about these three different terms, I'm realizing that that kind of whole area of belief and knowledge, for me, in my mind, I have it categorized under Gnosis. I have it categorized under, these are the things that I have decided are true about the nature of the universe, based on my own mystical experience, based on my own personal spiritual experiences, whether that's during ritual, whether that's out in walks, in nature, whether that is just from sitting in the garden under the sun, whether that is from doing deep path workings and active imagination, whether it's just from reading a spiritual book and having something really chime true with me and feel really really important on an emotional level, whether it's just from reading a story, a piece of fiction, a piece of poetry that just chimes true to me on some sort of deep emotional experiential level. That for me is all the kind of the area of Gnosis, and I have been gradually building up this body of knowledge that I associate with that kind of mode of being, that mode of belief, I suppose. And I definitely like all three of these areas to speak to one another. I have a complicated relationship with the idea of faith, because in my experience, it might actually be faith that helps to link these two areas together. So whereas I kind of feel like the way that Hanegraaff was moving towards in this statement, I could be completely wrong. Like I said, I didn't actually read that section very carefully because it wasn't directly relevant to what I was writing about in my PhD at the time, and I might go back and read it again. I feel like that he's kind of seeing Gnosis as maybe not bridging together faith and reason, but that it's kind of surpassing both of them, and that it leaves both of them kind of to be unnecessary in the eyes of New Agers. Whereas in my experience, both Gnosis and reason are very, very important to me. As a scientific pantheist, those to me are the two kind of most important areas of belief and thought for me in my day-to-day life. But I would say that faith is what links them together, and faith is what allows me to hold on to the structure of beliefs and the structure of practices that I have built and put together through the practice of Gnosis, through the practice of allowing myself to build up this body of knowledge and this body of understanding based on pure experience and feelings and a very subjective kind of interpretation of the world, as opposed to the very objective and kind of rational scientific kind of view of the world. So faith, for me, I have to kind of maintain faith in the idea of Gnosis and in the idea that there is value in actually having experientially based understandings of the world, and that, you know, it's important to actually act on those and to support those with practice and to support them in your everyday life. So that for me is what faith means as a pantheist, as a non-Christian. I think it means something quite different to me than it does to Christians or quite a lot of other types of religious people who use that word. And I wonder if that might actually help clarify a few things for people if you have been wondering about my use of that word, because I have got a whole series. Well, it's not much of a series. I'm hoping to add to it more in the future, but I do have a series called Faith Food, where I wanted to discuss the things, ideas and books and quotes and things like that that have fed me in terms of my faith, that keep my faith solid in my pantheism. But I definitely think that Gnosis, I think I was kind of conflating those two terms. So yeah, I feel like when I use the term faith in that way, when I'm talking about faith food, what I'm really talking about are those things that feed that sense of Gnosis, I suppose, that feed that body of knowledge and that is rooted in kind of mysteries, in the esoteric, in mysticism. And that is definitely different to faith because it requires that kind of body of experience. It requires being fed. It requires experience. It requires to go to the altar, to go to sacred space, to go to that place in my mind, to choose to look on the world in a certain way. So I don't know, I'd be very curious to hear from anybody who actually does have a Christian belief system, or a more Christian-ish belief system, or a belief system that you feel does require faith in some way, and how do you feel like I'm using these terms similarly or differently to you? I'd be very curious about that. But finally, I wanted to emphasize again just how much this gets focused on in our community, in the pagan community, in the alternative spiritual community, this idea that our practice and our beliefs are rooted in experience and in practice, rather than in things we read in holding faith in certain things and in having some sort of rigid theological perspective, or in choosing one authority and running with that authority and so on, or even in using our reason. I feel like this gets talked about a lot, that for a lot of pagans and for a lot of people in this general kind of sphere, the practice comes first almost, and devotion comes first. And whatever you gain or glean from that devotion, from that practice, that becomes your faith, that becomes your belief. And that it's very much that the practice comes first. It's very much this sort of, I don't know, I guess, build it and the gods will come to some degree, I think, is the understanding, especially for polytheists, because they believe, because the conclusion they've come to is that there are these kind of separate entities that are the gods. That's maybe a slightly different understanding to what's going on. For them, they believe that if you enter into this devotional practice, the gods will take note. For someone like me, it's more about changing your mindset, and it's more about building up this kind of body of knowledge and body of understanding. And from my perspective, if I'm operating from that place of Gnosis on a more regular basis, and if I'm making that a more central part of my life, I do start to experience the world in a different way. I do start to act differently, to think differently, and to feel differently. And I think that's really interesting. It's always been interesting to me that I have felt like this ability to just flit between different ways of experiencing the world, purely depending on my habits and purely depending on how I choose to explore the world and what kind of discourse I choose to engage with. I think I've always found that really, really interesting, and it just goes to show how important the stories we tell about the world are. But like I say, when it comes to this kind of understanding of Gnosis and the kind of pagan understanding in particular, it's not just about how you choose to think and how you choose to story things, but it's also about what you choose to do, because your mind is really only going to continue to have those kind of experiences, and you're only going to maybe reinforce to yourself the importance of that gnosis, of that type of knowledge, from backing it up with practice, from taking the time out of your day to acknowledge it and to do something about it, and to continue to nurture that part of your reality. So I feel like I'm in danger of really rambling with this one, so I'm going to wrap it up there, but I hope that you got something out of this. I would really love to hear your thoughts on this. And so yeah, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell for notifications, and I will talk to you again next week.